Welcome. This is our 51st. I can't believe it, but 51st webinar. I keep saying this every time. I'm stunned that we've been doing it for so long. I think mostly what I'm stunned by is that I keep coming up with topics and ideas. And, in many respects, and for those of you who are kind of regulars, um, it's kind of going over the same ground in many ways from many angles. And it's probably redundant, but people keep appearing, so it must be of some interest. Um, but in this case, it was one of those things where, you can take this simple model that we have in front of us to be the performance chain and sort of say, okay, well, that's how we do stuff. That's our model. But, um, as I started to reflect on it, I realized there's a reason I like it, and I think maybe other people might too, but I want to explore that a little bit. So that's what this today's session is about. Before we get into it, though, next month we're going to talk about change management. And I know at least Scott is someone who's familiar with ProScience ADKAR model, and a lot of other people are. And I'm not dissing ADKAR at all, but what it's going to be about is the fact that in that acronym, which stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. The word reinforcement, as in many contexts when that word is used, kind of means a bucket of stuff. It's not very precise. And when you look at the ProSci material, there's a lot of good things that are incorporated in it. Of course, I'm coming from a background in behavior science where reinforcement is a very specific term. It means something that comes after behavior that increases the likelihood or the probability of the frequency of that behavior. And if it doesn't, it can be called reinforcement if you're a strict behavior scientist. But we mean more than that here in this context. And so what I want to do is kind of unpack the reinforcement idea primarily using the 6 boxes model. And I think most of you will be familiar with that already, but it's kind of how do we think about change management and implementation planning, which I tend to think of that as being kind of in the same bucket. So that's what next month is on June 11th. And then I usually don't do my shameless commerce thing until the end, but I want to highlight this. And I know several of you have definitely been through this program. So I'm not asking you to do it again. But if you do have any colleagues, we've still got a few seats left, and it's been filling up with quite an interesting group of people. And actually, a fair number of folks have been coming to me wanting once again to go into their companies and work with a group of 10 plus or minus, one in the UK and some folks in Canada. But the open program, which we do 4 times a year, the next one starts on the 16th of June. And we don't have much. We've only got another couple of weeks to register for it. So if you know any people that might benefit from this, either because they're individuals and want to learn about a very straightforward and flexible approach to performance improvement, or because they're maybe testing it for a company to see if they want to bring it into their company, please point them here, and that QR code will get you to the information about it. Now, today's agenda, this is kind of more of an agenda, but this is sort of a travelogue, or it's sort of the things that I want to talk about. And so first thing is I want to talk about how, our work goes back to Skinner's behavior science. It goes through performance engineering in the version of Tom Gilbert and Joe Harless. And then we added simple models in plain English. And so that's kind of the evolution that performance thinking has taken, and I think the value add that we have. But one of the things about it is measurement. And there's lots of conversations about measurement. And I want to show you how the performance chain gives us a framework for thinking about measurement. And of course, if we're doing science or engineering, either way, we need standard units of measurement. So that's convenient. Of course, we're also accomplishment-based, and accomplishments are the valuable parts of performance, as Tom Gilbert pointed out. It's accomplishments that are valuable, and behavior is costly. And so a lot of people are interested in ROI, or return on investment. And so when you get explicit about that, the distinction between accomplishments and behavior, it makes it more straightforward to think about ROI and how you might calculate it. And then, of course, in the performance chain, we connect back to the six boxes model. And I would argue that that model, as simple as it is, and as plain Englishy as it is as a translation from Tom Gilbert's original behavior engineering model, is systemic. There's really nothing that I've been able to observe over the last quite a few decades that's out there that influences behavior that can't be framed either in one of the cells of the six boxes model or sometimes in connections between them. So, of course, part of the performance chain is behavior influences, and then we kind of unpack that with the six boxes model. And the other thing about the chain that I love, and I've really come to appreciate this more and more, is that it informs a logic for performance improvement. So you can follow job aids and methodologies and tools and algorithms and all that. But if you recognize that performance is behavior that produces work outputs or accomplishments that to the extent they're valuable contribute to organizational or business results, and you start with the end in mind, there's a logic there, which is to figure out what's at stake, to look at the accomplishments, to identify the behavior, and then to examine the behavior influences. And that's kind of a convenient way to think about it. It's also very flexible. And then, of course, another part of it, when we start to involve the humans, the people that work with or for us, or if we're in an organization, in a human resources group, or in a performance improvement group, or whatever it is we're trying to do with people, one of the beauties about the performance chain is if you think that way and you say, well, we do a lot of stuff. There's a lot of behavior we do. And like, how do we contribute again? And so the way we contribute is we produce valuable accomplishments through that behavior that contribute to organizational or business results. So it's a way, if we're managers or leaders, to make explicit to people how they're making a difference. And then the other thing is, and I'll come back to the word grok, but some of you who might have been science fiction fans, as I was when I was a teenager, might know Robert Heinlein's word in his book, in which he used the word grok. And that word meant to sort of have a big insight about something all at once. So that's what we mean by it. The simplicity of the model allows us to kind of look at the whole thing in ways. So that's kind of where I want to go here. And I want to sort of detail this stuff. Now, as all of you know, these are key contributors to this work. Now, I've left out Joe Harless today because I usually include Joe, because Joe really made what Tom Gilbert talked about in Human Competence, which was kind of a philosophy book more than anything else. Joe made it actionable. Stranger in a Strange Land. That's right, Kate. Exactly. And so that's not so much what I'm talking about here today. But Skinner created a natural science of behavior, and he's not often. A lot of people who know about B.F. Skinner don't know much about him. It used to be that if you brought B.F. Skinner, people had this very stereotyped negative view that, he just thinks we're a bunch of robots or something, which of course is not true. He just thought we could apply natural science to our own behavior and learn how to improve education, management, therapy, you name it. But what's critical to his science, and his science, unlike other social sciences or even some behavioristic versions of psychology, is a natural science because it uses standard units of measurement, time, count, etc., like physics or chemistry. It doesn't use things like percent correct or rating scales, which are not absolute standard units of measurement. He used rate of response. That was his contribution. But he focused on the units of analysis when we're looking at behavior. And that was a big informative thing to me as one of his students, and also as someone who's participated in behavior science now for about 50 years. And Lindsley, who was a student of his, did a couple things. First of all, he was very focused about bringing the measurement from Skinner's science, rate of response or behavior frequency, into practical application, originally with teachers. And of course, he sort of kicked me out of the education world in the 70s, and Og told me to go into business and try to apply what we had learned from that. But the big part, in many ways, of what his influence was on this work was the plain Englishness of it. He said, if we're going to go speak with regular folks who don't have a background in sort of nerdy behavior science, we should use plain English. And then, of course, Gilbert, who, again, I think of Tom as more a philosopher than a methodologist, because if you read his book, Behavior Engineering, human competence, um, there's a lot of brilliant ideas there, and many people have grabbed and run with those ideas, and it gives you kind of a framework for doing some stuff. But it's not exactly an actionable methodological book. It's a philosophy book. But what was cool about it in a certain way was he talked about performance engineering or engineering worthy performance. And the behavior engineering model, of course, which we adapted by using some plain language, brought the science into practice, into organizations. And so those were basically important conceptual contributors to all of this work. Now, I've shown versions of this to everybody in these sessions, and I'm sure you've seen them all. But, there's a lot of methodologies and models in the field of performance improvement. These are just like one review article from a few years ago. But what you're struck by is if you go to a performance improvement conference, is that everybody has their model. And one of the things that happens, I think, as we get advanced in fields is people get more detailed. They identify additional features. They look at it from different angles. And so every one of these little frameworks and models is useful and was useful to the people who created them and represent certain kinds of insights or perspective. But there's a lot of them, and they're all different, and they overlap. And so my experience with performance improvement folks, especially experienced ones, is that when confronted with a problem or an issue, they'll sort of grab the relevant model from their own history and they'll bring it forth and use it. Or this is the human performance technology model from the International Society of Performance Improvement, which was created by a few folks in that organization years ago. And I've, as some of you know, referred to this sometimes as the everything, including the kitchen sink model, because it's great. It's got everything you could do. But as a lot of our clients were noticing way back in the 80s and 90s, I had one client that I will always remember. She worked at Children's Hospital in Seattle. She was a senior for training and performance improvement person. They had a giant poster of that up in the wall. And I remember her stopping and showing it to me and saying, we're trying to do this, but it's really complicated. And when our executives come by, they say, oh, how long is this going to take? And, it's just complicated. And so I was affected profoundly by Steve Jobs in a lot of ways. And I would argue that in contrast to Steve, who believed that it's better to not include stuff if you can, to make it simple if you can, to make it so it's usable, accessible, you can get your arms around it. That HPT model is just way too complicated for usability. Now, there's a QR code there to a invited lecture I gave a few years ago about simplicity, if you want to dig into that whole concept. But so Steve said a very interesting thing. He quoted in this great book about Jobs, by Ken Segall called Insanely Simple. And again, you've probably seen me quote this many times, some of you, but he said, when you start looking at a problem and it seems really simple with all these simple solutions, you don't really understand the complexity of the problem. And then you get into the problem and you see it's really complicated, which is when a lot of the models start to develop, by the way. And you come up with all these convoluted solutions. And that's sort of the middle. It's where most people stop. And the solutions tend to work for a while. But you can keep on going and find the key underlying principle of the problem and come up with a beautiful, elegant solution that works. Now, as I always say, I'm no Steve Jobs, but when I read this years ago, it really felt like the sort of journey that I and my colleagues have been through in the last 35 years of taking the complexities of performance improvement and without making them simplistic, boiling them down to the essentials, the units of analysis and a systemic view of the behavior influences. So that's kind of what we've tried to do. And as you know, we have this notion that, of course, we want to have a framework that allows to analyze and communicate about performance in ways that are actionable. But the difference here is we want to use simple visual models in plain language that aren't simplistic, that don't eliminate stuff. They simply it incorporates stuff into a single framework, and that can be used across different levels and functions. So you got communities of practice that can actually work across silos and levels to drive collaboration, continuous improvement. And as you know, we've called this performance thinking because, as you'll see, it gives us a way to think about stuff in a way that's beyond just being a methodology or toolkit. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that Skinner science brought to bear on all of this work was the notion of units of analysis. So in his case, when he was looking at behavior, he had a very simple framework. He said there's responses, there's consequences, and there's antecedents. He used different language for it, but those were the units of analysis that you would be looking at. Now, I would say that the units of analysis are the way you deconstruct a thing that you're trying to analyze and measure, and in this case, human performance. So to me, the big sort of move forward, the big evolutionary explosion that Tom Gilbert and also Gary Rumler and some others, but especially Tom, introduced into the world was summarized in this famous statement. He said, in the great cult of behavior, which meant all of us basically, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And we've called those work outputs. And the reason we did that, and again, some of you know this, I'm sure, but one of the reasons that we did this years ago, really, was that the word accomplishment, if you look out into the field of performance improvement, like publications or ISPI, or if you look in the field of applied behavior analysis or organizational behavior management, where people have also studied and worked with Gilbert's stuff, accomplishments means a lot of different things to different people. Sometimes it means big, hairy things that I would think of as aggregate business results, like revenue or whatever. Other times it means widgets and everything in between. So I didn't want to argue with my colleagues about that. So we kind of coined this phrase that owes something to Gary Rumler and some to other people, but this phrase work outputs, because it's the product of work, at least when you're at work, when you're in the work life, and it's products, it's countable things. So that's the phrase we use synonymously to sort of simplify and clarify the concept. Now, we find work outputs in organizations. This is an organizational relationship map of a behavioral health company, and you can't even read it, but there's all these little boxes that are different departments and groups and functions, and there's even some boxes outside, like the regulators and the customers and the suppliers. But those folks and those departments and those groups are all passing outputs or accomplishments around. And they're often doing so in the context of processes. And if we drill down, we can find processes. So here's a simple process. Usually people talk about the steps in a process, and they map out processes with what do you do first, what do you do second, like that. And sometimes it's way complicated. This is a very simple example. But we want to emphasize that each step ought to have a valuable output that gets contributed to the next step, and there's value add. So we make a big deal of outputs and processes. And then, of course, we can look at individuals. We have this tool called the individual performance map, where we can say, here's this person or this role, here's their customers around the outside, and here's the things that they deliver to them. And they are things, they're nouns. So that's a core unit of analysis. This happens to be one of my favorite individual performance maps, because I have a lot of colleagues in the applied behavior analysis, behavioral health, autism industry. And the clinical supervisor, who is usually a board certified behavior analyst, that's what the acronym means, produces a lot of stuff. It's a complex job. So you can see all those outputs that are such fine print that you can't read them probably. But, we can define the outputs of a job. And that's an anchor, because that's the valuable contributions. Now, if we step back from it and we say, what are the units of analysis in performance? What I would argue is that there's three of them. There's behavior that we can define and we can count or checklist or observe. There's work outputs, which are the products of behavior. And there's organizational or business results to which those work outputs contribute. So I always like the soccer example, because people all over the world play soccer, and I've got clients in Dubai and Asia and the UK, and they know soccer more than they know American sports. So I always use soccer, and this young lady is kicking the ball. She's behaving. It's an action. We reflect it with a verb, or we describe it with a verb. She's producing a thing. Ideally, either she or a teammate is going to produce a goal, a ball in the net. And if they do so, it contributes to the score or winning the game. So that's a simple model. But again, there's these three elements of analysis behavior, work outputs, and organizational results. And we anchor our analysis in the performance chain to those outputs because that's what's valuable. And what we say, of course, is that, first of all, we also define, and I'll come back to this in a minute when we talk about measurement, but when we define an output, wherever it is, at the end of a process or inside the process, we want to define what the characteristics are of it that make it a good one. And we call that criteria for good, because we want to be able to say, this is a good one, this is not a good one, and we want to be able to measure that. But that's, again, it's core. And it works, from left to right. And we analyze it generally from right to left, whatever the situation is, whether we're applying this in an individual coaching situation or conversation, an informal discussion, or at the beginning of a big project. We want to know why we're doing this. What's at stake? So we start with the business or the organizational results, and those could be all kinds of things, and there's some examples of those under that. Once we know that, that will affect how we do the rest of the stuff, because then we talk about the work outputs, and probably the criteria for those work outputs include features that will make them most likely to contribute to business results, if you will, like timeliness or certain quality measures or whatever it is. And then we work backwards from that to behavior, because now we know what the behavior is supposed to produce, so it's a lot easier to define it. And then, of course, we go to behavior influences, which are not part of performance. They're what influences performance. Now, stepping through that agenda that I mentioned earlier, one of the things about science or engineering is that we need to be able to measure stuff. And when we have units of analysis, as we do here, we can measure these things. So we can measure organization or business results. They're usually aggregate measures. They're usually lagging indicators that you can only get maybe monthly or quarterly. It's important to get them, but we can't make a lot of decisions quickly in most cases because there are not enough data points to know if we've got a trend or a bounce or whatever. So they are lagging indicators, but important. We got behavior, which a lot of people think they know how to measure behavior, and you don't measure behavior by asking the manager if he thinks a behavior changed. You measure it by counting it or checklisting it or in some way actually measuring it. But doing so is pretty costly in most cases because it requires observation, sometimes inter-observer reliability issues and stuff. But work outputs that meet criteria we can count. And so that's often one of the best levers for measurement, even, best things to measure, even though not everybody gets that, not everybody knows that. But the ones that meet criteria, that's a big deal. And here's an article that happens to have a bunch of charts. You can't see this, but in the behavior case on the far left, what you see is correct responding and a practice activity accelerating and incorrect responding decelerating. In the middle one, we have actually calls that produce solutions for customers per hour, and you can see those accelerating. And on the right, we can see revenue in a small consulting firm. So those are all, you can measure these things. Another really important topic these days is return on investment. And Gilbert, long before I think ROI was so widely talked about back in the 70s when he wrote his book, he talked about the worth of an intervention, like if we're doing a training program or introducing a new system or job aids or whatever, something intended to improve performance. We ought to look at the value of the accomplishments that it enables people to produce better or more, divided by the cost to do it. And it's one of the reasons that Joe Harless was very big on job aids. Instead of pulling people out and putting them through a training session that took quite a lot to design and develop effectively and took their time and all the rest of it, maybe we could just design and test a good job aid, give it to the person on the job, set some expectations and provide some feedback, and they could get up to speed on whatever the thing is without all that expense. So maybe there's a better ROI in many cases with things like job aids or online performance support. But whatever the case, this was a kind of a nice way of thinking about it. And these days we talk about that as ROI. It's the same concept. So we can address that. We can check that thing off once we have an understanding of using the performance chain. And then, of course, if we go to the behavior influences part, what is it that influences the behavior to produce the outputs that contribute to organizational results? That goes back to Skinner, too, because this was Skinner's way of talking about what influences behavior in the laboratory with pigeons and rats and monkeys and dogs and other non-human critters. And eventually, Lindsley took that into the human operant laboratory, as well as my main mentor that I worked for 10 years in our operant conditioning lab for people. But this is slightly nerdy, but it says discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses, which are hopefully followed by reinforcing stimuli, which will increase the likelihood of. Now, they might be punishing stimuli, in which case it would decrease it. But that was the way Skinner framed it, remembering that in the laboratories where he was studying behavior, they designed what they call the manipulandum, the levers or keys or buttons or whatever it was that people were responding, and they actually designed them to fit whatever the organism was that they were working with. So it was built ergonomically to be perfectly suited to the size, shape, strength, and et cetera of the organism. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Some people turned that, by the way, into antecedents, behavior, and consequences to make it a little bit more plain English. But what Gilbert did was brilliant, because what he recognized was in the world of work, as he called it, we got some of the stuff in the environment that affects behavior, and we got some stuff that we got to put in the person, or that you could think of as individually determined. So on the top, he has informational stuff, which he called data. Now that word turns out to be a little bit of a problem because people don't quite know what it means. Could mean all kinds of stuff. And then there were instruments, which are like the manipulandum or the switch or whatever in the laboratory. In our case, it might be software or the right screwdriver or having people we can turn to or having a process design that supports us. But he called it instruments. And then there were incentives, which in common parlance usually means something that you're told, if you do this, you'll get this payoff. But of course, there's other kinds of consequences that you don't even know they're coming. Unintended negative consequences or nice positive consequences. But that was how he dealt with the consequences thing. And then in the individual, we need to be sure that the person has the knowledge or the skills. In other words, what they need to know to do the job. And then capacity, which meant the individual capacity. Is this person well suited for the job? Are they aligned with our values? Are they strong enough or sociable enough or analytical enough or have math skills or whatever it is to fit the job requirements? A lot of people confuse this with organizational capacity, though, so that's sometimes been problematic. And then motives was a good way of thinking about whether the incentives are actually going to work. Because if you offer me an incentive or if there are consequences that I don't care about, they're not going to improve my behavior. They're not going to change my behavior. So what Gilbert pointed out was we better understand the motives of our people, because that will help us arrange the other conditions. Now, this is a brilliant model. And probably all of you, I would bet, I'm looking at names here, a lot of you have used, probably used this model at one time or another. But when I encountered it, I thought it was fantastic. And this was like in about 1981 that I started using it a lot. But what I realized was our clients kept making these category errors. The words just didn't quite work for them. So that's when they like, what's that mean? What are instruments, And so we tweaked it. And as all of you know, I've said this a billion times and most of the people in this right here have been in this when I've said this, we user tested the language. We tried a bunch of language to reflect what we understood to be in those categories. And I frankly think we expanded and made more robust the categories than Gilbert typically used them. And we came up with this. And it's the same framework, really. So I pay homage to Tom for it. But what I've learned is that people find this very useful and they don't make a lot of mistakes with it. And there's a webinar there you can go to that's more about how the model was developed and stuff. But that's now at the front end of the performance chain, which are the whole system, because I haven't yet to find anything that doesn't fit into this that affects behavior. So that's part of the performance chain also. And as you all know, this is not a set of categories. These are not 6 lists. What these are is functions which work together typically and need to be aligned if they're going to work properly. So it really is a system of things, especially if you optimize it. And then finally, what this leads us to, once we have this very simple little model, this performance chain model, is what I've called, I don't know why I started calling it this, except that we refer to our work as performance thinking. So I guess logic is the underpinning of thinking. But what we said is there's a logic here. As I've already mentioned, step one, figure out what's at stake. Be sure you know that and you've aligned with your client or the person you're working with. Step two, look at whatever that performance is and figure out what the work outputs are. Identify them, observe, do an analysis, do interviews and so forth, do a process map, and be sure that all those outputs really are contribute to business results. Because if they don't, maybe they're not worth including. That's a kind of a lean approach. And then the third thing is, once we know what the outputs are, it's a heck of a lot easier to figure out what the behavior ought to be. We can do a task analysis. We can observe successful performers. We can grab some special tricks from our exemplary performers. There's a lot of ways we can do it, but what's cool about it is that the work outputs guide us to the behavior. So there's a sequential kind of dependency there. Once we got those three things, as I already mentioned, you got something you can measure, and some combination of those things are probably what you're going to measure. And now we've got that handled. So now we move into the 6 boxes model with behavior influences, and we do a design thinking thing. We analyze what's currently in place, what's working, what's not working. We brainstorm, ideally kind of very robustly, green lighted brainstorm, to think about all the things we could do to fix those gaps or to fix whatever is missing or is not working. And then ideally with our stakeholders, depending on who it is and the context, we choose the best combination of those things to build or design a performance system. Maybe very simple, maybe just somebody I'm coaching and we have some agreed upon action steps, or it may be a big, hairy 2-year project in which we look at a whole lot of things and then we optimize it by trying to figure out what all the factors ought to be and how they should fit together. And then we kick it off or we implement it and we measure it, and almost guaranteed we won't have captured everything perfectly. So there's a continuous improvement implicit in there, the notion that let's keep looking at this and be sure we haven't missed anything. And let's come back in a while and take a look and maybe do another quick and dirty analysis. And then the beauty of our 21 plain English words and 2 simple pictures is that we can share the language people and they don't even know we're sharing a language. They just say, oh, expectations. Yeah, you're right. We ought to be clear about that. They don't think you're using a term of art or a technical term or whatever. And then, of course, I already mentioned the thing about this, which is that, and this was kind of a discovery of mine relatively late in the game. I probably didn't fully appreciate this until about 15 years ago, because what I recognized, especially when we developed our coaching program, our accomplishment-based coaching program, we recognized that when you're having a discussion with somebody who's working for you or who you're coaching, and they may be doing something repeatedly that seems just boring or uninteresting. And my classic example of that is filling out some little simple form on a computer that they fill out way many times a day, or like session notes for customer service reps or for behavioral health people after they work with a client or after they work with a customer. They're supposed to annotate what happened. Well, if those things are not done well, you sometimes risk auditing and negative audit outputs if you're in a behavioral health environment. Or you sometimes, like if you're in a customer service department and your session note after a conversation is kind of fuzzy, if that customer calls back a few hours or a few days later and talks to somebody else, that somebody else is not going to have the information that they need to continue the conversation. So that's a very important contributor to operational efficiency, possibly to customer satisfaction, perhaps to regulatory compliance, et cetera. So one of the beauties of the performance chain, once people start thinking that way, is you can say, that silly little thing you do a zillion times a day, well, that's really a big deal. It's important to get that right, because if you don't, we could suffer some bad consequences. And if you do it well, it's going to make it really better for the next guy or for us to address the auditing issue or whatever it is. So I love this aspect of it. And I got pretty deeply into employee engagement. As many of you know, we discovered some years ago when we looked at the Gallup 12 employee engagement survey that the items on that 12-item list sort rather nicely into the six boxes model. And we're not going to go there, but there's a webinar that we did a couple years ago on that, and that QR code gets you there. So this has been pretty quick, and I'm hoping we have some discussion. I'm hoping you guys will ask questions, make comments, bring up insights and stuff, because we're going to finish in a few minutes here and have plenty of time left. I would argue then that the performance chain informs how we think about stuff. It first of all makes very clear the elements of performance in our analysis and the dependencies between them. So it allows us to look at the thing, and without having a big complicated mess in front of us, to say, oh, these are the elements. Now, even in big complicated projects where you might be dealing with 20, 30, or 50 outputs, it's a lot of work. But the analysis itself is moderately straightforward. It's not magic. You follow the logic of it. And as I say, there's a logic based on prerequisite analysis, in the sense that you can't fully understand the next thing as you work from the end toward the beginning until you've understood the previous thing. Now, there's an interesting piece of this that my former partner used to say, and I thought it was a brilliant insight on her part, which was that when you are accustomed to when you sort of are used to thinking about the performance chain and viewing performance through that screen, you have to get good so you can go back and forth fluently. So somebody gives you some behavior, and instead of saying, well, I need to know something else, you say, oh, well, what does that produce? How do you know you're done? You move to accomplishments. Why is that important to the organization? Oh, okay, that contributes to profitability or whatever. Or they talk about, their outputs, and then you say, well, can you show me what you do to produce that? Or let me go and watch Jack because he's really good at this. And so these things lead to one another, and you can sort of descend into the performance chain in any place and know kind of where to go to get a clear picture. So the logic of it is not rigid. It's not like a procedure, but it has this prerequisite notion, this set of dependencies. So that's how it also informs our thinking. It simplifies how we identify gaps and opportunities too, because I'm always struck when I see some of those models that I shared earlier. And, a lot of times there'll be some new article, and probably some of you are familiar with this because I know some of you read up a lot on this field in general. But I will see these various categories of behavior influences or things thought to be important. And sometimes the list is very long. And there's almost always the case I say, wait a minute, they're not addressing the issue of tools, or it's unclear about expectations here, whatever. And the beauty of the six boxes model, first of all, is that it really does frame all possible behavior influences. So that makes it simpler. There's just six things and how they relate to one another. But also, even before we get to behavior influences, we can look at the elements of the performance chain, behavior producing outputs that contribute to organizational results. And for example, criteria for a good one. If we look at an accomplishment and we're really crisp about what the features of that thing need to be in order to be good and contribute to business results in the way we know they should, that clicks back to expectation setting in the six boxes model. But it also is a place where you say, oh, well, no wonder we haven't defined the criteria. So you find a gap right there. But I'd also, with this language, like to say something, which is that it's a little bit of a tangent, but we've got a couple minutes here. So Don Toasty, the late Don Toasty, who was an important contributor to performance improvement, he and I used to have some really interesting conversations. And one of the things he said to me many years ago, in fact, we even did a joint presentation once at a conference on it, was that in the beginning, the field of performance improvement came out of instructional systems design. And the early instructional systems design people, which included people like Breathauer and Rummler and some of the early performance improvement guys in Gilbert, was about optimizing the system. It was about how do we build an instructional system so that we get the most learning for the least time and expense and the fewer errors. But he said, then what happened was when the quality and process movement kicked in like the 70s and 80s, became a really big deal. People started applying some of the same kind of thinking, except they were looking at why we get defective widgets off the end of the assembly line. So it shifted from being an optimization thing to being a problem solving and root cause analysis thing. And what Don said and sort of taught me, and I believe this strongly, is that I would much rather view performance improvement as a design engineering discipline where we're trying to be sure we have the most cost effective combination of factors in the system to optimize performance, to optimize return on investment, rather than saying, "Oh, let's plug the hole in the dike." That's why there's a leak, there's a hole in the dike. So I think um, my my preference, the reason I bring this up is because so often when I hear my colleagues talk about performance improvement, they start out with gap analysis. Or some of the most common uses of our six boxes model that I hear from colleagues is in root cause analysis and process. Nothing wrong with any of that. The only thing I would say is don't stop by just fixing the gaps. Try to optimize it. And with the six boxes model, you have a framework for seeing how all the pieces fit together. And you can brainstorm stuff and you can say, wait a minute, there may be a cheaper element for this thing and a more effective thing, et cetera. So try to think of this as an optimization, continuous improvement, design engineering discipline than just about gaps. And that's why we include the word opportunities in there, because there's chances to improve. So Nancy, I'm glad that I informed you on that, because most people don't know. And a lot of people have been introduced to this field really through kind of, problem solving. And then, um, uh, the chain connects simply to what influences performance to the six boxes model. So that's kind of obvious. But the six boxes model itself is a really cool thinking framework. And I think a bunch of you have probably adopted it or used it. But what I've observed over whenever it was, 1987 or something, when I first renamed the categories, what I've observed over those decades is I now like visualize the six boxes without even trying. And I remember, oh, wait a minute, we got some skills and knowledge, but I guess in box 4, but box 2, we could have a job aid and it might accelerate the ability to do that. In fact, we might even be able to not do training and just give them a job aid. And if we did that, maybe we need to get box 1, expectations and feedback, cranked up a little bit at the beginning. And oh, by the way, though, if we give people a support tool, or even a job aid in box 2, let's be sure they have the skills and they know how to use it. So you're looking at these things and how they all connect with one another. And to me, that's enormous. It's when you get fluent with that, it's a really nice, it's a nice thing. It's way better than that big, complicated, HPT model. And then this is where Joe Harless, there you go. But this is where the grok word came from. And as Kate reminded me, the title of the book where it came up was Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. This is back in the 60s that this science fiction book came out. But the notion of grokking, I mean, there's a lot of ways people think about it. I actually looked it up, just out of curiosity, because I use this word periodically. And the phrase that I saw most often in the description on Google and stuff was a profound intuitive understanding is what it means to grok something. What I mean by it is to be able to see the thing as a whole, to say, oh, that's how it works. And I believe that one of the big advantages that I didn't really understand when I first did this plain English thing with Og Lindsley's influence and with Steve Jobs' influence was that when you have not just the plain language, but the simple models, as we say, 2 simple pictures and 21 plain English words, that you can get your arms around it. You can right away in one shot see the whole system. And in informal as well as formal situations, you can kind of see how it all works, which is very different from looking at all those models that I flashed at you earlier, where there's all these parts, but you're never going to see how they all fit together, because this is a single, simple picture with words about the dynamics and the functions of any hunk of performance you could imagine. So people don't know what it means. So I'm loving seeing this in your bullet. Oh, grok. Okay, fair enough. Well, now I've told you what I think it means. And then the other thing that's nice about the performance chain and the whole framework is that, in fact, when I speak with, I've shared this with a number of people here, but when I've spoken with people who've been doing this performance thinking thing for some years, like, probably the person who knows more about this than I do is Gina Restrezadru, who was at Amgen, and now she's in another company kind of redoing what she did there, which was to certify 300 plus performance thinking practitioners and support the community practice. But she's done and coached hundreds of projects over the years in very demanding environments. But even if you've just been using it a little bit for the last few years or whatever, what you start to recognize and what people report to me was maybe 20 or 30% of their time applies this to projects where they're doing the kind of thing that we coach people through in our practitioner program, where, as some of you know, the way our certification process works is we take you through instruction with a practice of the components, but then we help you select a real project in your environment. We coach you through, and you get a certificate when you've produced a description of what you did and a thorough analysis of whatever that hunk of performance was, which results in recommendations or a design or the components of an improvement in a big hairy spreadsheet we call a multi-table. Once you've gone through that analysis and design process, that's when we certify you. And what people say is maybe 20 or 30% of their work when they've learned this is devoted to that. But much more of it is when they're in meetings or casual conversations and they just have an insight. Classic examples that I think of, remember a long time ago, a couple of my colleagues at Fifth Third Bank in Ohio, they had gone through the program, and one of them was in a meeting where they had human resource business partners who recently had been centralized into the bank's home office, but there were still a bunch of them that were placed out in the branches. And she was in a meeting where they said, these people are stepping on each other's toes. They're kind of duplicating effort, and there's some conflict coming up. And she just said, my colleague just said in the meeting, has anybody defined their work? That is their work outputs. Because what she recognized was if they did that, it would be a heck of a lot easier to say, what the boundaries are and what you're supposed to produce and for what customers and so forth. Or the other example, so many times people have, people who are not performing very well. And what they recognize is, oh, no wonder these people are not getting consistent feedback. Like a call center that I was in years ago, and I asked one of the really exemplary performers, customer representatives, customer service representatives, I said, well, how are those expectations? How do you get your expectations? And she said, kind of rolling her eyes, she said, well, it sort of depends who the supervisor is in that shift, because he tells me to use this system to do it, and she tells me to do this system, so I have to pick. And so what you realize is a lot of environments, there's just that simple thing, and which is the expectations thing. And so a lot of times we're using this because it's simple in kind of ad hoc on the moment. So why do we love the performance chain? This is red instead of orange. I would say, for me, and I've been hesitant to say this kind of stuff until recently, because I tend to think of this. I've been working with this thing since the late 80s. And I tend to think of it as a little model, and it's kind of got some plain language in it and stuff. And it seems kind of useful. And we've taught a lot of people how to use it. But I have so many people coming back to me, some of whom have used this framework for a long time, saying, this changed my life. This changed my professional career. I look at my personal life this way now. It's like, oh, this is a bigger deal than I thought. And so at a minimum, I would say my personal experience is, and some of the people I know, that we love this model, especially the performance chain, because it simply helps us do performance analysis and continuous improvement in a much simpler, cleaner way. And it's even a simple tool. They use that phrase, hot knife through butter. You can take big, hairy, complicated stuff and make sense out of it with this. And I used to say to people, and I've sort of given up this now, but for years when I was doing a lot of consulting rather than just teaching people this work, I would go into another client in a new industry with some new kind of performance, like factory maintenance at Intel versus customer service or sales, where I'd done stuff before. And I'd be in this like, I don't know if it's going to work, man. I'm like, but it does. You just follow it and it's helpful. So, anyway, that's what I have to say today. We've got a few minutes left. I hope you'll chime in a little bit. If you're watching this, first of all, this, like all of our other stuff, will go on performancethinking.tv, our YouTube channel, within the next few days, so you can point people to it. One of the things that some of our colleagues are finding useful, I think, about the performance thinking YouTube channel. In fact, I have a colleague in Malaysia, actually, who is he's an amazing guy. He used to be a cage fighter and rugby player, and now he's an executive coach. He's really something. But I asked him, "Have you ever spent time on our YouTube channel?" He says, "Every chance I get." So some people find it super useful, but even if it's not something you live on, if you've got clients or colleagues or folks who you're trying to turn on to thinking about performance, we've got enough webinars in there now that you can find one that would be relevant to whatever the topic is, and you can send them a link. And I tend to do that. I say, "Oh, you might be interested in this." So anyway, that's there. And then if you're watching this recording on YouTube, please share it. Please like it. Please, subscribe to it. We'd like to have a bigger impact, and that would be very helpful. So that's what I have to say. What do you guys think? I got to catch up on the chat box here a little bit, but if anybody wants to speak, I know Erwin almost always does, but if other people want to talk, I'm looking at John's comments about, Human Competence is kind of a philosophy book. How do you simplify this to a manager who's very busy, has 10 employees, each with different personalities and attitudes? Well, Erwin, to answer your question or comment about that in the chat box, first of all, what I talked about here is kind of from a performance improvement consultant's perspective. We do have a coaching program. And of course, coaching is a big deal in a lot of companies. They adopt all kinds of coaching models, and there's some standard ones out there. But what we've taught managers to do is to sit down with their people and get pretty good at identifying the work outputs that are expected from those people, so that both the person they're managing or coaching and the manager or leader or whoever it is that's working with them has clear expectations about what they're supposed to produce for whom. And then coaching or performance improvement can be, after that initial discussion, can be pretty quick and dirty, like, "Oh, that requirements analysis document that you got to produce this week, let me take a look at it. I'll give you some feedback." Or, "Oh, I heard that your relationship with the manager in HR is not so good. Let's problem solve that. Let's see what the criteria ought to be and maybe make some suggestions for improving it." If you can build your work with the folks that report to you around sort of one output at a time, it's a heck of a lot easier to problem solve, what we found. So that's at least one way to simplify it. And just saying the second comment is steps for you as a manager, and start with what you're trying to accomplish. Exactly. Yeah, there you go. That's fair, Erwin. So anybody, you can, if you want to talk, I believe you can, let me just double check here, but I think you can raise your hand or something if you want to speak, or if you just want to have chat conversation. What do you guys think? I've just been blathering on. Do you love the performance state? So John said, "That's how your current project is a pretty hairy one. You're helping this guy redesign his business." I know that. Anyone? Any comments? So Kate, so Nancy, would you like to, I think you have to raise your hand, or I don't know. See, I don't have the, oh, there's Gina. All right. Nice to see you, Gina. You were a lurker. I didn't see your name here before. Oh, that's wonderful to hear these things from you guys. So Patty, you're saying you're still trying to figure out how to apply it in your settings. I'd start simple. It depends on what your job is. But if you're an instructional designer, for example, and you're trying to do analysis, one of the suggestions we make is, if you can turn your learning objectives into outputs rather than behavior or skills and knowledge, it would be lovely. If you can say at the end of this module, you'd be able to produce a better relationship with your direct report, or a widget, or a machine that's properly adjusted, or a requirements document, that's a starting place. because it will then direct you toward figuring out what a good one is, what the best way to produce that is, and then you can use the 6 boxes. That's at least one way to get started. Okay, anyone else? Any other comments or questions? So when I saw Nancy, you said you do. Did that mean you wanted to speak? Because I think you can. I think there should be on your interface a thing which allows you to raise your hand and ask to speak. But if not, you could text. Yeah, Erwin, the thing about Aubrey, old friend of mine for sure, is that I think his framework is incomplete, which is that he was big on positive reinforcement, which is great, and feedback. But a lot of times you can have positive reinforcement up the wazoo, and if your tools suck, or if your process is poorly designed, or if expectations are unclear, or some of the other variables that are defined by the 6 boxes model, it's not going to necessarily work that way. Okay, so let's see. How do we do this? Maybe if let's see, just a second here. Edit, invite as a presenter. Maybe that will work. Let's see. I'm going to invite you as a presenter, Nancy, and see if that helps. Did you get any kind of an invitation? Or maybe I can do it this way. I've not used this. Erwin's the only person I think who has successfully. Yeah, there you go, Gina. With tough groups, start with something simple. Yeah, that's a big one. Um, I'm gonna, and I don't know what your email address is a thing. So I just, well, so Nancy, I'm sorry. I should get better at figuring out how this thing works from your angle. I think I need to have somebody else be a presenter at some time, and for me to figure out what you do at your end, because I don't think I have the same interface. But maybe you can type what your question or comment. You working with people who did performance, says Nancy, but I'm not sure what to make of that. Don, okay, Don says it like it is. He says, seems if anyone resists, they're in an abstract mode of thinking. I think that's true. Well, you're back. I don't know what to do about it, Nancy, but maybe you can type your question or comment. I have to solve this problem for the future. Yeah, I guess what I find is with the drawing people into it part, to come back to that theme that Erwin is mentioning, is that I just start using the language. And the language of the 6 boxes is easy enough because people don't even know it's a model necessarily, but then you can draw it up on a whiteboard or a piece of paper or a napkin or something and share it with them, and they can begin to get it. Probably one of the best examples I know was Gina's predecessor at Amgen, who did a viral approach where he would introduce this to people, and some people say, no, I don't want to do that, just give me the training. And then he'd say, okay. And then he'd go on to somebody else, and then somebody would grab onto it, and he'd do something that would make a difference, and he'd tell them to share it. And so over time, that would spread. Yes, Kate, that's a big one. In fact, one of the reasons, that's a really important point. In fact, I think we could do a whole webinar on this topic. Kate says, I find it helpful to involve the clients or the colleagues in the solutions. And I think there's several places you can do that. Up front, if you do a process map with them, they help you identify the steps and the outputs. If you do individual performance maps with them, they help you define the outputs. So you're already speaking with whoever they are to identify the core of the performance. But then when you get to behavior influences, you can engage them in the brainstorming process. We got these things, and there's some problems in some of the cells of the model here. What could we do? What do you think? And or you can engage them in the choosing what they're finally going to apply. Yeah, Erwin's point is well taken, that people have different language. And what I've observed is that in the same organization, a lot of times people have, the senior executives have certain kinds of language that's sort of executive speak, and then the junior people, have some different language. Um, Nancy. Okay, there you go. She says when she received her master's degree, someone suggested she join ASTD, and a professor said join ISPI. I would agree with that. The only thing that makes me very sad is that ISPI has shrunken a lot. And, there was a point where it was the time when I was most involved. I mean, I still support them because they helped make my career. But ISPI, between sort of the 70s and maybe 15 years ago, all of the great thought leaders were still alive and there, and you could go learn directly from them. Now I go there. Yeah, now I go there and I'm like, I'm the old guy, I can't hang out with Harless or Gilbert or Rummler or Bob Nager or, countless other people anymore. Yeah. But good news on that, Nancy, is the Southern California chapter. There's a chapter that combined the Boise State Performance Improvement Master's Program with the Bay Area folks. Now the Minnesota chapter, they all do virtual sessions. And so it's getting the Armed Forces chapter, I think was the first one that did it because they were stationed all over the place. But what used to be regional chapters are now online. If you look for them, you can, I think, become members and you can participate in their meetings. And it's actually a good way to collaborate across boundaries. Anyway, we're at the hour. I have to make a note to myself to get this, how to let people speak, because I've got it set so you can ask to speak, but we haven't figured out how to make it work. Oh, yes, we do. I just finally saw this. Okay, I'm going to accept this, Nancy. And if you want to speak, I just accepted that. I missed that there was a little indication that you could do that. So I don't know if that's going to work or not. But we should probably end now. And thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your participation. This has been, I hope, fun for you. It certainly was fun for me. So I'm going to end now, I think. Thank you.